In this video, I'm going to show you how to use the Context API in class components. So in the source folder, let's add a new folder called Context. Now in this folder, let's add a couple of components to represent a hierarchy. So the first one is going to be movie page.jsx, and the second is going to be movie list.jsx. So on the movie page, we're going to have a movie list. Now let's implement these components. So over here, we type RCC tab. Now we have a class component called movie list. Here, let's just render movie list. Save the changes. Beautiful. Now on the movie page, first, let's implement this as a class component. Now here, we're going to render a movie list. So movie list. Pretty straightforward. Now in our app component, we want to render a movie page component. So let's go to app.js. Now the new create React app package generates this as a functional component. So for this demo, let's delete everything in this file and generate a new app component using a class. So delete RCC tab. There you go. Finally, we render a movie page here. Good. Save the changes. So here's our component tree. We have the app component on the top, then movie page and movie list. Let's say the app component stores the current user, and we want to access it inside this component. Perhaps based on the current user, we want to render some content dynamically. For example, if the user is logged in, we want to display an edit link. Otherwise, we want to hide it. So here in the app component, let's define some state. We set it to an object with a property called current user, which is an object itself. And here we have a property called name set to, let's say, Mosh. Save the changes. Now to pass this object down our component tree, we need to create a context object. So in our context folder, we add a new file called user context.js. In a real application, we can have different types of contexts. So we use the user context to share the current user. We could also have a theme context for sharing the current theme and so on. Now, in this file, first we need to import React. Next, we call React.createContext. This returns a context object. Now, by convention, we should name this object using the Pascal naming convention, the same convention we use to name our components. So let's call that user context. So we capitalize the first letter of every word, okay? Now finally, we should export this. So export default user context. Good. So the first step is to create a context object. We have done that. The second step is to provide this in the top component. In this case, we're going to go to our app component and provide our user context. So first, we need to import it. Import user context from the context folder /user context. Now we're going to wrap this element inside a provider component. So we type user context dot. Look, this object has three properties: consumer, provider, and display name. We're going to look at each of these individually. So first, let's use the provider. This returns a provider component. So we're wrapping these elements inside a provider component. Now, this provider component is nothing magical. It's just like a regular React component. It has a special prop called value. And this is where we're going to pass an object down our component tree. In this case, we're going to pass this object. So we type this.state.current user. Okay? Save the changes. The third step is to consume this context somewhere in our component tree. We can go to any component. In this case, we're going to go to our movie list and consume the user context. First, we need to import it on the top. So import user context from the user context module. Now, we have to wrap this element inside a consumer component, just like how we wrapped the content of the app component inside a provider component. So we type user context that consumer like this. Now here's the tricky part. This component expects a function as a child. So we cannot pass this div over here. Otherwise, we're going to get a runtime error. Let me show you. So this is the error I was talking about. Render is not a function. This happened because we passed this element directly as a child of this component. But this component expects a function. So here we should pass a lambda expression. So we add an expression. This function should have a parameter. We could call it anything. We can call it value, or we can call it user context. This goes to, and this is where we're going to return our div element. So the consumer component expects a function as its child. Okay. Now save the changes. Back in the browser. We don't have any errors. Look at our component tree. On the top, we have the app component. Below that, we have context.provider. This is a generic name that is automatically generated. But as we create different types of contexts, it's a good practice to give each context an explicit name. So we go to our user context file. And after we create this context object, we set user context.display name to a specific name, like user context. Now, back in the browser, instead of context.provider, we have user context.provider. So this is a good practice that you need to follow. Now, below this, we have our movie page component, movie list component, and here we have a consumer. Now, this consumer has a context object, which is an object with a property called name set to Mosh. This is our current user. So we can get the name of the current user and render it on the movie list. Let me show you. So we go to our movie list component. This user context object that we have over here is exactly this context object that you see here. So after movie list, we can render user context dot name. You could also rename this to current user, whatever you prefer. Now save the changes. And here's the name of the current user. Beautiful. So this is how we use the context API. First, we create a context object, then we provide it, and finally we consume it. Very easy. Now, what if you want to consume this context outside of the render method? Let's say in one of the lifecycle hooks like component did mount. In that method, we don't have access to this consumer component. So how are we going to work with this user context object? That is pretty easy. First, after creating this class, we need to set one of its static properties. So we type movie list dot context type. This is what I mean by a static property, a property that belongs to a class, not an object. Okay. So we set the context type property to user context. That is the user context that we imported on the top. Nothing magical. Now let's implement the component did mount method. Over here, we can log the context using that context. So this property returns our current user object. Take a look. So here in the console tab, we have this object that represents the current user. Now, in a real application, we can make decisions in this component based on the current user. One last thing before we finish this video. There is another way to set the context type property. Instead of setting it after creating the class, we can set it as part of creating the class. So let's delete this line. We go over here. Inside this class, we type static context type, and then we set it to user context. So this static keyword is saying that we're setting a static property on this class. Some people prefer the second approach. Other people prefer to set it explicitly after creating the class component. So this is how we use the context API in class components. Next, I'm going to show you how to use the context API in functional components.